Which country in the world has the fourth largest economy, the most free economy, a government with the lowest levels of corruption in the world, as measured by the Index of Economic Freedom in 2018, and one of the world's best education systems as measured by PISA scores? This country, rising to become a world power by many different metrics, is not one of the giants in landmass like the powers of the past. This nation is in a small, geographically important area that will be crucial to the future of Southeast Asia and the world at large. This nation is called Singapore. Because it's so different from other economic powers, I began to wonder to myself what it is about Singapore that sets it apart from other similar, small nations in the world that haven't risen to Singapore's level. Our primary objective today is to analyze the factors that led to a rise in Singapore's modern-day economic power. To do this, I need to examine the question of how Singapore rose to become an economically powerful country in the world. Included in this discussion are the major factors that led to economic growth of Singapore over time: geography, foreign investment, ability to limit ethnic issues in the country, leadership in the country, and a propensity for timing and economic conversion. As laid out for you just now, the first factor we will discuss is the geography of Singapore. Singapore's geography alone plays a large role in why the country has always been such a valuable area to own. Singapore is in an area that demands heavy investment for defense, as it is located at a strait that throughout history has been deemed extremely important. This area, known as the Strait of Malacca, is located at a critical juncture of trade between China, India, and Indonesia. Singapore is located right on the coast, and many empires in the past made investments to protect this area to try to dominate valuable trade networks adjacent to the strait. Chinese and Indian traders used this area to trade with each other since ancient times, and also to reach the spice trade in Indonesia. The Buddhist Srijaya state, sorry if that was horribly mispronounced, established more permanent settlements in the area between the 7th to the 10th century. Malacca dominated the area later under the Muslim empires until the 1500s, when the Portuguese took control. The Portuguese ruled the region for around a century, when they were eventually supplanted by the Dutch, who were eventually supplanted by the British, keeping with the typical pattern of many Indian and Pacific Ocean colonies during the 18th and 19th century. The fact that the area changed hands so many times and almost always went to the winning side of conflicts from Europe shows that it was an area of very high value to all of those interested in the region. As a British outpost, modern Singapore was born in the 1800s. The British exploited a rivalry between two brothers during a war of succession. Backing one of the sides, Britain was gifted a land grant to establish a trading post near the Malacca Strait. In 1819, a British man named Sir Thomas Raffles began to invest in this trading post and established the area that would one day become Singapore. Due to the marketing abilities of Raffles, Singapore received investments from the richest country on earth, Britain, which in turn made Singapore, well, very rich. In 1824, the British East India Company took control over the island and much of Malaysia, further pumping investment into the area. In 1867, the East India Company was forced to give up control over these colonies directly to the British Crown. Throughout the 1800s, as the British expanded their holdings in India and China, money made its way into Singapore, making it a very powerful colony of Britain under the British East India Company. Due to its strategic location between China and India, Singapore continued to grow. However, geography was far from the only thing that contributed to the growth of Singapore during this time. Major movements outside of this immediate area brought in new sources of wealth that would make the population and the economy explode. Singapore's geographic importance received a huge man-made boost with the construction of the Suez Canal in Egypt in 1869. This had the effect of facilitating trade in between the Mediterranean Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean trade networks, where European countries were increasingly active in the later 1800s. This was accelerated with the discovery of oil, tin, and rubber from sources near the region. British interest in the area increased drastically as these resources flowed from the Strait of Malacca and fed the empire all around the world. As Singapore's importance grew, so did its population of workers. By 1871, 2 years following the construction of the Suez Canal, the population of Singapore had ballooned to almost 100,000 people. The country continued to grow economically throughout the late 1800s with an influx of migrant workers from all different backgrounds. By the early 1900s, the population of Singapore was over 225,000 people, increasing to over 500,000 people by the 1930s. After World War I, Britain attempted to turn Singapore into an area from which their colonies in the East Indies could be defended and built naval bases in the area, further generating revenue for the colony. As we go through this story, remember this theme of foreign investment into the area, as it is a major factor of growth. The Suez Canal was merely the first instance of economic investment from foreign countries, making Singapore more economically viable as it stepped toward nationhood. As with most other countries, World War II was a catastrophic time for Singapore. In 1942, in an event that would result in the loss of faith in the British military, the British surrendered Singapore to the Japanese. The Japanese were ruthless in exploiting the wealth of the region, as they hoped to sustain their war effort in China and against the United States in the Pacific. The people of the area suffered as a result. In the Suk Ching massacres, thousands of Malaysians, including many Singaporeans, were killed. In 1945, this tragic era came to an end with the final defeat of the Japanese. However, the process of decolonization was yet to be undertaken. Though free from the Japanese, the British continued to hold on to Singapore for another couple decades. There were still a lot of economic positives to staying as a British colony. Britain put more foreign investment into Singapore as they wanted to support the military bases they still had in the area. However, Singapore was about to find an even bigger giant to bankroll their development moving forward. The world had developed into a two-player struggle for hegemony between the capitalists and the communists. Through this contest, Singapore not only found its political independence from Britain, but also set itself up on the road to financial success as a nation. After suffering through Japanese occupation, Singapore joined the former British colonies all across the world who clamored for decolonization. Since holding the empire together began to have more costs than it did benefits, England started the long process of decolonization following World War II. However, the terms of decolonization were very unclear. No length of time for decolonization was ever specifically mentioned. In addition, it was very unclear as to how exactly this withdrawal would be carried out, and there were a ton of considerations to the situation of withdrawal. Britain did not want to leave its colonies economically weak and politically vulnerable, especially with consideration to the rising competition between capitalist and communist ideologies worldwide during the post-World War II Cold War era. Britain, especially with the influence of Winston Churchill, was not about to cede their former colonies without first attempting to stabilize their economies as a bulwark against communist movements that were taking place across British colonies. This was not the most convincing argument to those still living in those British colonies, though, and many people living in those colonies continually pressed for independence. Nevertheless, we still see more foreign investment pour into Singapore as a result of this Cold War era conflict. Simultaneous to these international conflicts, ethnic tensions within Singapore threatened to tear the nation apart before it could even get its independence. When one thinks of ethnic conflict in Singapore, they typically think of the Maria Hertog riots. A court case decision over the custody of a girl named Maria Hertog sparked riots in Singapore that left around 20 dead and more injured. This case originated in the World War II occupation time period, when a Dutch Catholic mother had given her daughter, Maria, to a friend while her father had been imprisoned as a POW. This friend, Shea Amina, raised Maria Islamic. After the war, Maria's family wanted her to return to their custody. Maria was now 13 and wanted to stay with Shea Amina. Initially, the court decided to allow Maria to stay with the Islamic family she had been raised by. However, 4 days after the initial decision, Maria, at age 13, had been given to a 22-year-old man for marriage. He was her teacher at the school she attended. With this under consideration, Maria's family won custody on appeal. However, many perceived that the appeal decision had more to do with the fact that she was being raised Muslim than it did with the facts of the case. As a result, Singapore experienced riots after the case was over. While these riots did rock the nation for 2 straight days in December 1950, one thing they did not do was destroy the nation from within. Eventually, concessions were made to the Muslim community to make them feel more accepted in Singapore, and riots did not occur with regularity. Because the British, who were still in charge at the time, handled this situation delicately and with sensitivity to local interests, Singapore did not experience the kind of problems that were present in the Indian movement for independence or similar movements in the Middle East. It's not to say that there weren't other riots having to do with racial tensions in the 1950s and 1960s. However, none of them resulted in a separatist movement to challenge government control overall. The lack of chronic, violent ethnic tensions contributed to Singapore's ability to establish an economically successful country. Singapore remains a very diverse country today. Another large difference between Singapore and many other countries going through decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s is that decolonization was in part driven by a genius leader in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. Yew ruled Singapore for its first 30 years of existence. Yew knew that British assistance would be critical in making sure that the island remained economically strong. With Singapore's small size, Yew believed it would never become a military power. Because of this, it would be critical to become economically strong. In addition to getting investment from Britain, over time, Yew became increasingly involved with gaining foreign investment from Japan and the United States into Singaporean industries. With communism potentially spreading from China and the Soviet Union, Yew took advantage of the US's containment policy on communism. In doing so, he was convincing the most economically powerful country in the world to dump additional funds into the development of Singapore. Yew also handled foreign policy with neighboring countries very well. Despite the fact that Singapore and Malaysia received their independence from Britain simultaneously in 1963, and were initially joined as a country, Singapore's independence in 1965 was not met with civil war or any conflict that would have crippled the economy before it could get off the ground. This can be credited to the ability of Singapore's leadership to work out a peaceful secession from other Malaysian nations. No grudges were really held. In 1967, both Singapore and Malaysia joined an organization known as ASEAN. This stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This organization was designed to promote economic growth and political safety for all the countries within it. In joining this bloc, Singapore was ensuring that it would limit diplomatic issues with its neighbors. Last, Yew and the Singapore leadership convinced the British to slow their withdrawal of military bases to best fit the needs of the country. This gave Yew time to prepare and retrain workers, some of whom simply took jobs at commercial docks that replaced the old British base. While only some retraining programs were effective, only around 3,300 out of the 10,000 workers from the docks stayed on, the British also gave the Singaporeans a nice severance package of £50 million, which Yew used to build up the infrastructure of the economy for workers who did not continue to stay on the docks. Unemployment numbers of 1967, which had once looked problematic at 8.1%, had fallen to a little over half that number, 4.5%, by 1971. Much of this thanks to Yew's help in setting up a structure for a successful economy. Another factor leading to Singapore's economic success is the fluid nature of its economy. The leaders of the country have done well in transitioning the economy to make it successful for whatever time period was going on. For much of the early part of Singapore's history, throughout the 1800s, Singapore's economy was based on trade and raw materials, which at the time was the focus of the world economy. Following World War II, in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, the Singaporeans embarked on a transition to become a production economy. Moving toward the 1980s, Singapore's leaders recognized another economic shift and successfully tied up the world economy with a transition to the financial sector of banking and information/technology. With China's economy opening up and becoming more capitalist in the 1980s, this timing was nearly perfect, as a large, geographically close country was now opening up to the idea of taking investments internationally. This knack for timing and economic transition continues in Singapore even today. Now, Singapore successfully markets itself as a place where higher education can be obtained that is respected worldwide. This in itself brings a lot of money and a lot of wealthy people into the country. As in earlier times, Singapore's geography is again key in its marketing. The country markets its location as just a 7-hour flight from China and India. Many refer to the university as the Harvard of the East. And outside of education, plenty of businesses are still going to Singapore today to discuss technological trades and other deals. Unemployment is currently below 2%, and GDP growth is still around 3% per year, a pretty strong number for an economically established country. Singapore is an instructive example of how a small, formerly third world country can quickly transform itself into a world power economically. There's no denying that Singapore has received some help outside of its control on the road to success, whether it be from the geography of the nation or its convenient timing when it comes to getting foreign investment. However, the real key to Singapore's success is in the policies that they adopted and the ability of the country's shrewd political leadership to utilize the advantages that they got just on happenstance to create an economically powerful nation. It is through the continuation of sound policy and shrewd leadership that Singapore can avoid becoming the Venice of the East and instead continue to meet the challenges that lie ahead as the country moves forward in the 21st century. To echo the national anthem of the country, onward, Singapore.